Hey, welcome back to Road Tripping with Rachel. I'm Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me here on this road trip. If you are new to the channel, I tend to do a lot of Bible studies. Right now, we're working our way through the book of Acts and the history of the early church. I've also done studies through Genesis, John, Nehemiah, Ezra, and we're just working through Acts right now. We are getting ready to go into Acts chapter 16, and normally these are posted in the morning on Wednesdays, at least twice a month. However, you know what? I am being social right now. And so my ability to film is a bit more limited. And I did a major clean out of my room and bathroom over the weekend. And my bathroom looks very cute right now, very cottagey, very vibey, as the kids like to say. And that makes me sound like the millennial that I am. But you know what? I'm happy with it. It took a lot of time. I was very tired and didn't film as much as I wanted to. But as we are getting into Acts chapter 16, just as a quick review, we went over Paul, the very first church council, the Jerusalem Council in the year 50, and now getting into Acts chapter 16, Paul and Barnabas have actually gone their separate ways. They had a disagreement. Not that either of them was necessarily right or wrong, but they chose to go in two separate directions, and now Paul is traveling with Silas. And as we open in 16, we are introduced to Timothy. Silas and Timothy are two very well-known disciples of Paul. When I was working on my seminary degree, the seminary actually launched what they refer to as Timothy groups, which were for people, primarily they were for young men who were interested in going into like a pastorate. They were not like there for like what I was there for, where my interest was not to go work for a church. It was to work for different ministries. It was primarily designed for young men who were wanting to go into the pastorate. And Timothy was a young, I guess you could say he was half Jewish, half Israeli. His mother was a devout Jewish woman who had come to Christ, and his father was a Greek. It's very specific about stating that his father was Greek, because Timothy, when Paul met him, was not circumcised. Now, I've talked a bit about circumcision in other videos, so I'm not going to go like real into deep detail with it, but Paul actually ends up circumcising Timothy, which Timothy was an adult man. But with that though, that would have been extremely painful to go through. But it was because Timothy's mother was Jewish that Paul said we needed to go on ahead and circumcise him, because Paul's theory to missions was, because he had been a Jewish Pharisee, he would always start by going into the synagogues, and the synagogues would not have accepted Timothy. And so it wasn't that him not being circumcised wasn't okay. It was. We just had the Council of Jerusalem. Circumcision was not necessary for salvation. But because of the culture that he was going to be interacting with, it behooved him to go on ahead and be circumcised. That way, he would be taken more seriously by that group of individuals. So we meet Timothy, and then from there, Paul and Timothy and Silas end up going into Europe. So they end up taking the gospel into Europe. Now, the first place they went, they were traveling to Macedonia. And if you are a history buff, you should recognize Macedonia, because there is another very well-known figure in history who came from Macedonia, and that was Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great fell in love with Greek culture, and he was the reason that Hellenism spread all throughout the Roman Empire after Rome eventually took over. Alexander the Great was the primary proponent of spreading Greek culture all throughout the Middle East, all throughout the, I guess you could say, claimed Europe at that point. And then later on, when Rome became a powerhouse, they fully embraced Hellenism as well, with some changes. I would make the argument Rome didn't really create anything in and of itself. It took a lot of the ideas from Greece and then it just built on top of them. Nothing wrong with that, essentially, but Roman culture has sprung out of Greek culture, though, in my opinion. My opinion. So in this, they end up now primarily going to much more Greek areas. Now, that's not to say that Paul still wasn't going to the synagogues. He was, but now you're getting into now a cultural shift away from seeing a densely populated Jewish area, and you're moving now into a much more densely populated Greek and Hellenistic era. And what that means is that the culture is going to be much more obvious. It's going to be less of a mix of Jewish and Greek culture and much more Greek. And because it is much more Greek, the way you're going to have to approach it and the things that you're going to be interacting with are going to be different. Whereas whenever you went to a area that was primarily Jewish, you're going to have the synagogue. You're going to have people who are going to be more aware of Jewish culture, and the farther away you get from that, the less awareness there is going to be. It would be the same as if I were to go into a completely different area. I mean, I'm Midwestern born and bred. That comes out in my speech. It comes out in my appearance. So if I were to go into a completely different culture, the farther away from the Midwest I would go, the less likely I am to interact with people who would have a similar upbringing to me. It's just the way the world works. Nothing wrong with that. But because they start doing all this traveling, they get to meet a lot of other very important individuals who help to propitiate the church and helping establish like local congregations all throughout Europe, which eventually help them get into Rome, and which will eventually, as it permeates Rome, eventually takes it across Europe later on throughout the next few hundred years, which ultimately will result in Pilgrims and Puritans and Catholicism and Orthodox, and it's going to result in the Anabaptists and the Baptists and the Methodists and the Episcopalians, and eventually they're going to go across the pond, and they're going to end up here in the colonies and the unclaimed land, and that is eventually going to lead to how I ended up on YouTube. But this very important woman that they meet is named Lydia. And Lydia eventually was a Greek woman who was a business owner. She did purple cloth, so she was a specialty tradeswoman. And as a specialty tradeswoman, she was very wealthy. Wealthy enough that she had her own household. It makes no reference to there being a spouse or her living with a brother or living with family of any kind, just her and her household. So if she did have a family, she was the head of it. And she ends up inviting them in. They stay with her. She eventually becomes the host for a local church. And it is from her home that we start to see more and more churches will eventually pop up. From Lydia, then poor Paul and Silas, they end up in prison because that seems to be just Paul's MO. Like churches get planted, the Spirit is moving. You get stoned, end up in prison, or you get tossed out of town. That's just the way it goes with Paul. But they do end up in prison, and Paul, who is actually a Roman citizen, which was a big deal. He was actually a citizen of the city of Rome, not just the Roman Empire, because Italy is actually not that old of a country. I know that if you remember like World War I history, Italy really is not that old as a unified country. Rome is very, very old. Okay, so Paul, as a Roman citizen, says like, I want a formal apology because you shouldn't have thrown me in prison without like going through like X, Y, and Z. They let him out, they give him a formal apology, and that eventually leads to Paul and Silas going to Thessalonica. You'll recognize the name Thessalonica because we also have these two lovely letters called 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. So Paul will eventually plant churches here, and he will write letters to them later on. While he is in Thessalonica, though, there are riots. They were not welcoming. to the gospel while they were there. The people were not interested. They didn't want to hear it. They basically chased him out of town, is what they did. Sounds kind of similar to some other things that have happened to Paul. But he gets chased out of town, and eventually he ends up going to the area of Berea. And Berea, or the Bereans who are there, are like polar opposite of Thessalonica. While there were riots in Thessalonica, you get into Berea, and Paul goes into the synagogues as per his MO, and he begins preaching the gospel, and he has dialogue with the people there. And instead of being hard-hearted and refusing to hear what Paul has to say, the people who are there in the synagogue say, look, we're going to test what you're saying, which is very healthy and something you should do. Don't always take everything that you hear in a sermon or in a podcast or read in a book. Don't even, like, even what I'm saying now, you don't take it always at face value. You need to go in and you need to search the scriptures and see how does everything line up. Now we can get into the whole discussion about hermeneutics. I've kind of talked about that in other videos, but you do need to place what you hear people saying and what you hear them talking about up against scripture. If it's not lining up with what the word of God says, not your interpretation of it, but what God's word does say. Because like I said, hermeneutics, there's always going to be a little bit of interpretation and bias. The goal is to try and keep that limited as much as possible. But this is what the Bereans did. They took what Paul was saying and they went back and they searched the scriptures and they interacted with it and they dialogued about it. And as a result, because these discussions were taking place, there were also a lot of Greek men and women who were also hearing about what was going on. And they were also coming and asking questions and searching the scriptures as well and asking their Jewish neighbors questions. And next thing you know, you're starting to see the Spirit of God really working here in this city. And you see people coming to Christ, both Jew and Greek. And all of these people coming together and believing. But then, because the people of Thessalonica could not just let Paul leave, they had to make a nuisance of themselves. They come and try to stir everybody up. I mean, can you imagine having so little to do with your life that you follow someone around and just like try and make their life miserable? That has got to be a miserable existence. It has to be. Anyway, they apparently do it, and they go to Berea, and the Bereans actually help Paul sneak out and get to Athens. Silas and Timothy end up staying, but the rest of the people ended up helping get Paul into Athens. And while Paul is waiting for Silas and Timothy to join him, Paul ends up going through Athens, and he goes to I can never say the word, and I apologize for that. It's Areopagus. I want to say the Acropolis, but I know that's not the correct word. But Paul goes there, and he ends up ultimately in a debate. And what Athens has, which if you remember your history, if you're in Missouri, this would have been like your 10th grade history, 10th grade world history. You know, Athens was really the place of learning. You had Sparta and you had Athens. Sparta was the place of war. Athens was the place of this little thing called democracy and learning and like education and what we would consider in like medieval and even in modern times to be like, you know, the upper echelon of things that people participated in. Logic and mathematics and medicine and law and strategy, and you know, they would have been playing chess and philosophy and like all these other things. They come out of Athens, okay? And Paul is there, and he finds this area where it is full of shrines, pretty much, and offerings to all these different gods and goddesses. You know, you got Zeus, you got Aphrodite, you got Hera, Hephaestus, you got Hermes, you got all of these gods. And then he finds one that is to the unknown God. And that is what really sparks this dialogue, not just because Paul was sad to see so much faith being put into things they didn't really even know about, but that they were so concerned about were they praying to all of the right gods that they even had the unknown God just in case they missed anything. I find that sad too, that we would put so much faith in everything and then have something where we're like, and just in case we missed anything, here's this offering too. It really would be a sad way to live. But as they go through, Paul begins really having this dialogue with these people, and he takes it from the scriptures and he uses logic. I think, especially in today's world, we think about the church as parking our brains at the door and just having blind faith. Faith was never meant to be blind. Even in the Old Testament, there were signs and wonders that proved who God said that he was. And we need to be able to have intelligent conversations. We need to be able to think. We need to be able to read and understand data. We need to be able to have the same standard of learning and research and education that the secular world has. It is that lack of even being able to meet that standard, because I was in seminary, let me tell you, I know that the standard is low. I kind of don't know how I managed to graduate with my master's, okay? I go back and look at some of the stuff now and I was like, why did I get that grade? Why? But I digress. The idea is that we need to be a thinking people. We need to be people of faith who have thoughts in our head, and we can articulate those thoughts. With that, Paul is using apologetics. He's using logic. He's using philosophy, because he would have been an educated man as well. He's interacting with them on a very intellectual level. And it is because he was doing that he was really able to gain respect. And that helps him later on throughout his ministry in that surrounding area. And if you are interested in pursuing more and learning more about apologetics, just a few people whose books that I had to read while I was in seminary, William Lane Craig is a good one for just like basic apologetics. Another one that I really, really like, he is a cultural critic of primarily American culture. He is a British gentleman named Os Guinness. Yes, he is related to the company. He is related there. Not sponsored in any way, shape, or form. But one of the books that I have that I read by him was called Fool's Talk, and it's about being able to interact and use our mind and use logic and be able to really participate in the art of dialogue and discussion and debate. Being able to participate on those levels with people who are not believers. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. You can also look for apologetics. It's a pretty wide field. So you can find some that are very basic, and you can find some that are much more in-depth detailed. John Lennox is a professor at Cambridge or Oxford. I apologize if you ever find this Dr. Lennox. But he is a mathematician. He would be very good to read. Reading through some of C.S. Lewis's other works would be another thing that you could read, another direction that you could go. They're books that are very much for thinkers. Even some of Tolkien's other works would be really good. G.K. Chesterton would be another place that you could go to look, and these are all older thoughts and thinking. Very, very intelligent individuals who contributed widely to the higher thoughts of Christianity and being able to engage within the secular field. That's all I have right now for 16 and 17. I got into 17 whenever we started talking about Lydia, but I hope that this just gives you a little something to think about during your own Bible studies and your own quiet time, or that it gives you something to think about if you are leading a small group and you're currently going through the book of Acts, that this gives you something to think about, to consider, to maybe force you just to stretch just a little bit in your thoughts. I'm always happy to take comments and see what kind of discussion that we can get going. Otherwise, I hope to see you all next time whenever we get into chapter 18 and we start talking about the founding point of the Corinthian church. Bye.